I was starting to lose my hair because of the treatments I was on, and people could see that. And what's interesting is that chronic illness can feel lonely because not only are you sometimes on a treasure hunt to get the pieces of the puzzle so you can have the diagnosis, you don't always look sick. And so people respond to you differently depending on how you look. Welcome to The Middle. I'm Ganel-Lyn Condie, your host, and I love having guests on the yellow couch, and I love when I get to be here, just you and I, share some of my personal thoughts and my own middles. And today we're going to talk about one kind of big one in my life, and I don't think it's one of the things that people most know about me, which is interesting because it's taken up a big chunk of my life. And that is my diagnosis with lupus. I've dealt with chronic illness and specifically more with lupus I was diagnosed 25 years ago. So it's been a long middle for me. And I was diagnosed soon after being married. I can see before that diagnosis that symptoms were already showing up. I had a few things happen when I was in high school that felt very random. And this is not unique just to lupus. That's why I start with that part of the story. If you deal with chronic illness, what I've come to know, that wilderness experience usually starts with these random symptoms, or there's parts of you that don't seem to be functioning the way they used to. And you're trying to piece the puzzle together. And that was for sure my story. When I was able to finally have a diagnosis, there were a number of symptoms that happened all at the same time. But then when we got that umbrella label, I could look back and think, oh, that's why that happened in high school. And that's why that happened. I had seizures. I had certain migraines and other situations that separately didn't equal some big diagnosis, but together, when I was finally able to meet with a specialist and have this diagnosis, it explained some things. That's also part of the chronic illness story. If you have a chronic illness, no matter what it is, I think one of the most painful parts of the beginning of the middle is trying to figure out what's wrong. And usually you're reading things, you're talking to specialists, you're talking to friends and family, and you're not sure why things aren't working. And that alone, I think, is the most stressful part at a point to this story for me. And I was grateful in many ways that I had a diagnosis pretty quickly after having some significant symptoms show up. But at the time I was diagnosed with lupus, I was able to read in medical books that I had 10 years to live. Now, fast forward another 20, 22 years, and obviously I'm still here. And I've learned a lot in this process. This middle for me has been a teacher. And I know that for chronic illness warriors, they're not always noticeable. Sometimes when I've been my sickest, no one knows that. When I'm dealing with the longer list of symptoms that are more debilitating for me, most people feel like I'm doing great and they wouldn't even know. Because of my specific illness, I had long bouts of being treated with chemotherapy, and with that, the side effects of chemotherapy. And that in and of itself, the treatments oftentimes for chronic illness become a secondary thing that you're trying to manage and navigate around. When I was first diagnosed, the doctors told me I would never have children, that it was too dangerous because my lupus had gone into my heart, and I had a heart condition, and it was advancing fairly quickly. From a spiritual standpoint, I always felt during all of that unraveling and trying to put the pieces together and get diagnoses and figure out treatments and find specialists. And here I'm newly married, and now we're being told we wouldn't have children. I knew in my soul that one day I would be a mother. I didn't know how that was going to look, but in my faith, I really clung to a blessing I had received, and I knew that at some point I would have that opportunity. But at that point, it wasn't time. But there was this grieving going on. I was, young and newly married and in college and working, and all of a sudden I felt very old. My body didn't seem to match what my heart wanted to do. And I think that's fairly common with chronic illness, or any diagnosis for that matter. And I remember feeling one day that I had to rely on God more than I had ever relied on him before, because I woke up each day and I had a limited number of hours I felt I had energy to do what was on my to-do list. And my to-do list outweighed the number of hours I had energy for. And so early on, one of the greatest lessons I've learned through this teacher, that's what I call lupus as a teacher for me, was to rely on God. And I would pray to him and say, help direct my steps today so I am doing what is the most important, not everything on my list. And for a recovering perfectionist, if you've watched my Saints Unscripted episode on being a perfectionist, I talk about that more in detail. That not getting everything done was a big deal for me. And in those early days when I was trying to wrestle with this new body and how the disease was manifesting, there were new pains and struggles that I had never experienced before. Arthritis was somewhat not observable then. It is more now. The older I've gotten, you can see it in parts of my body. And I was starting to lose my hair because of the treatments I was on, and people could see that. And what's interesting is that chronic illness can feel lonely, because not only are you sometimes on a treasure hunt to get the pieces of the puzzle so you can have the diagnosis, you don't always look sick. And so people respond to you differently depending on how you look. So once I was on chemotherapy and I had this heart condition that no one could see, but they could see the hair falling out, the response was different. For a time, I wasn't sure how to measure what help I needed. I didn't even know what to ask for. I didn't know what people could do to help me. And people were so well-meaning. Once they started to hear that I had an official diagnosis, everybody came out of the woodwork. They wanted me to try their product. They wanted to buy me this special mattress. They wanted to put me on this supplement. They wanted me to go to their doctor. And I'm not dismissing any of those tools, because as I've lived with this and I've learned from this diagnosis of lupus, I too have expanded my toolbox. I know how the disease manifests. I know what triggers a flare-up for me, and I know how to get help, and I know when I need more ideas. But it was overwhelming at first because everyone wanted to help me and they wanted to give me their solution. And so I'm going to give permission. If you're dealing with a chronic illness, I'm going to validate you first and foremost that maybe not everyone treats you as if you're sick because they can't see that you are. And oftentimes they want to help you, and the help becomes a hurt because you're overwhelmed with all these suggestions of doctors to go to and supplements to try and diets to try and exercise to try and read this blog post and follow this Instagram person because they have your diagnosis and this is what they're doing. I'm going to give you permission to give yourself time. If you're in the early stages of your middle, so you're at the beginning now of this story and you're just kind of getting used to your new normal, give yourself permission to have space to figure out what will work for you. And the other advice I want to give is that if you can see your diagnosis as a teacher or as a stewardship assignment, that has been the most helpful for me. I don't define myself as someone that has lupus. That's why if you follow me on social media, you once in a while will see that hashtag, but not often. And that's not because I'm hiding this. It's part of my story and journey, but it's not all of who I am. But there were seasons of my life where that was the priority. My health, lupus, was the focus. And that's where I had to put a lot of my energy. I don't want to ruin the story, but if you know me from social media, you know I did become a mom. I have 2 amazing children. They're miracles for me. And I'm grateful for this teacher of lupus. It has taught me to say no. It's taught me to ask for help. It's taught me to seek out resources that might not be traditional, to figure out what I need to be my best self. It's taught me the value of not judging, that when I see someone and they say they're dealing with something, it may not look the way I think it's going to look. And that's created in me a place to have empathy. I might not experience your struggle with race, or that you identify as gay, or that you've gone through a divorce. But I've gone through this middle in a way that it's taught me to understand what it looks like to not have all the answers and to be in the process. On this show, In the Middle, we talk about that. We unpack those stories because it was really lonely at times. I just remember a day where my husband and I went to a support group. And when we walked in, it felt so good to be in a room with a whole bunch of people that had the same diagnosis as I did. But I left that support group feeling discouraged because out of everyone in that meeting, I was the most severe. The disease was ravaging my heart and my body, and my treatments were really severe at the time. And so I left feeling a little bit like, who understands what I'm going through? I may not know what your diagnosis is. I may not deal with your same chronic illness. You may have found this episode and you don't even deal with chronic illness, but you love someone that does, and you want to be a friend or a support to them, and you don't know how. This is my greatest tip. Ask them. Ask your loved one, what does support look like for you? I could write a book on all the kind of offensive things people said trying to be helpful, and we all do that. We're human. I say things all the time that I think are comforting or supportive, and I'm sure later on the person's like, that was not helpful at all. But one of the greatest things for me is when friends didn't get frustrated that I had to cancel on them or that I was always late to appointments at a time, that they were understanding when I just didn't work great in the morning, or that I wasn't sure that if we made plans today, next week I could show up. I'm grateful for the friends that stuck with me, and they didn't give me the cliche answers that it was all going to be okay, but they listened. And then they would give me the advice when I asked for their thoughts. So if you have a loved one that's struggling right now, ask them to teach you how their illness is showing up. Because specifically with lupus, but I think a lot of chronic illness, there's a range. We've talked on the middle about depression and anxiety. We've talked about race. We've talked about our faith journeys. We've talked about these concepts and these subjects that are complicated. And there's not one story. I think it was Alex Boyer when he came and shared his experience with race. He said if you filled a room with Black men, they'd all have a different story. And the same is true with chronic illness. So ask your loved one, how is lupus, MS, Crohn's disease showing up in your life? Help me understand so I can be a support to you. And then follow up with, what does support look like for you? Because it's going to change. I've lived with this teacher, lupus, for over 25 years, and I'm grateful for it. That doesn't mean that I am always grateful for how it shows up, that I'm always grateful for the limitations that sometimes I feel or the pain that I feel, but I'm grateful for who I've become because of it. The biggest thing that I've come to learn is that I have to rely on God. He's bigger than me. He's bigger than my diagnosis. And he understands even when I feel like no one else does. I hope I've become more empathetic because of this diagnosis. And I've heard from a lot of people on social media that I don't look like I'm sick, or how have I written these books or done all these speaking events or host video shows and feel this way. I think that's the other part of this journey, this middle for me, is that when I was in the middle, the heart of it, at the beginning especially, I had to say no to a lot. It wasn't a time where I was starting new projects and trying to fill up my day with more things. I'm going to give you permission if you're at the beginning of this middle, or maybe you're in the middle or at the end, you've been living with your diagnosis for a while, that it's okay to adjust. It's okay to say no. It's okay to say no so you can say yes to something else. I hope that something that I've shared today has given you some validation. If you have felt alone, if you felt judged, if you felt like you aren't your best self and you're not sure how your disease is going to play out and you're scared, I validate that. We don't know. None of us know really what tomorrow is. I hope that the idea that maybe your diagnosis has become a teacher and can be that for you in the future, even if it doesn't feel that way now, that you'll lean into that you'll lean into the process and maybe journal about what you're learning. Because I know that you also will be the support for someone else. And maybe it's sharing this video. Maybe you know someone and you don't know how to have the conversation because you can tell that maybe they're not showing up the way they used to show up in your relationship with them. Send them this link and invite a conversation. Say, I'd love to have a conversation. I don't know if I've always said the best things or been the most supportive, and I want to in the future. Thank you for watching The Middle. I hope you'll like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our wonderful conversations, and we'll see you again here soon.